everyone, and welcome to another episode of Common Sense with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm your host, Ben Carson, and I'm excited for our discussion today about China, trade, national security, and the future of justice in our country. My guest is best known for his work as a PhD economist and expert in China. He has written several books on the topic, such as Death by China and Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World. He served as an assistant to the president in the Trump White House as director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. He continues to fight for what is right, even after the end of the administration, resulting in a treacherous journey that he probably never thought he would have to embark upon. And by now, you probably recognize who I'm talking about. He had a fantastic address at the RNC convention detailing his long legal battle. And we have none other than Peter Navarro. Welcome, Peter, to the broadcast, and thanks for being with us today.
Doc, you were one of my absolute favorites during those 4 years. I think you and I were one of the few who was there from beginning to end. We fought the good fight, and we really have a fight ahead of us in the next 60 days or so to make sure that Donald Trump wins that White House again. And that's what I'm dedicated to. I know you're dedicated to that too, sir. So a lot of issues to talk about.
Yeah, we're going to face every trick in the book. But, as you look back on the White House years, what do you think were the greatest Trump accomplishments vis-a-vis China, their aggression and their interference with American manufacturing?
It was a 1-2 punch, Dr. Carson. What we had to do going into the White House was overcome the wrong perception that somehow communist China was our friend and not a threat. I think a lot of the American people had already begun to understand just how deep that threat was, particularly in what we call now the battleground states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, places like that, where China had come in after the World Trade Organization and devastated these communities, stealing their factories and jobs. But that was a challenge. It wasn't conventional wisdom when Donald Trump went in that communist China was the greatest existential threat to us economically and military. So it was a great achievement just to change attitudes on that. And then in terms of addressing the China threat, you have to mark the Trump tariffs on China as his greatest achievement. You can see it's one of the very few things that Biden and Harris left in place because even they could understand that we are under attack from China. And that battle in and of itself, Dr. Carson, that was a brutal battle where the president and I, folks like Bob Lighthouse, you didn't just have to fight the outside world. We had a lot of people inside the administration who didn't want to go along with that. So it was a battle, but he came out on the other side of that. And that was a very big deal.
Absolutely. Well, how do we, in your opinion, repair some of the damage to our manufacturing base that has happened over the last few years?
Well, my remit in the White House, I was the director of the Office of Manufacturing and Trade. And what the president commanded me to do was a couple of things. One is, first of all the fair trade issues we had to deal with the tariffs. It wasn't just putting tariffs on China. We had our steel and aluminum industries under siege, and those are critical for our national defense. And Trump put tariffs on those industries as well. But you take something like the Department of Commerce. A lot of people don't know that that's as important. It's as important as the United States Trade Representative Office when it comes to fighting China, because it has the power to do what they call anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So we have to have the full range of tariff and duty protection against China. But there's also something we began to do in the first term, which is also the investment restrictions. In a lot of ways, restricting the flow of American capital, particularly from our pension fund, which is insane, into communist China to fund their military and their infrastructure. That's just wrong. And so that's another approach we have to take. And then the other thing I did was the Buy American, Hire American initiatives. I must have helped draft, I don't know, 6 or 7 Buy American orders alone that the president signed. And when you get your manufacturing back in the United States, you also bring your supply chains home. So this is about defending ourselves from what I call Communist China's 7 deadly sins. It was the counterfeiting and piracy and the unfair subsidies, the currency manipulation, the state-owned enterprise, using things like tariffs and the like to defend, but then also using stuff like Buy American, Hire American to bring home our manufacturing base and supply chains. And that's very much a job left undone so far. And you sir, in your profession know full well we are dangerously dependent on pharmaceuticals from the communist Chinese, and that's a problem. Trade deficit with China, which results from all the stuff folks, Americans go to the store and buy at the big box retailers. Our deficit is about exactly equal to the Chinese military budget, which means we are financing their missiles, their aircraft carriers, their submarines, their hypersonic weaponry, their space rockets that are going up and try to get to the moon before we are. All of those things are weapons that they want to use not to nuke us into oblivion, but to win without firing a shot. That's the old Sun Tzu art of war admonition. That's what they want to do. So we're going to have to be very aggressive about this. The tariffs, the investment restrictions. We got to take a really hard look at these grains of sand coming into our country that are setting up in our research labs. And just the news that just broke in the last week about a high-ranking deputy chief of staff in the governor's office of New York worked for both Hochul, the current governor, and Cuomo, the previous one. It ran one of the most elaborate influence operations in New York, the state of New York. I mean, one of the things they did was screw Taiwan to prevent anybody in the governor's office from having any interaction with Taiwan. This woman, Linda's son, did it. And she did it because her husband it's over $10 million in counting. They're like condos and Ferraris and all sorts of things that the communist Chinese are paying Linda's son's husband to advance Chinese foreign policy in the state of New York. Right? Eric Swalwell, that's what we call a honeypot, Dr. Carson, a honeypot, where they excuse me, that's what we call a money pot. That's where they give a bunch of money out. The honeypots, the seduction. You remember the Congressman Eric Swalwell, Democrat? A woman named Fang seduced him, pillow talk, and out went a lot of secrets. The guy was on the Intelligence Committee. Think of that. And he's still in Congress. That didn't bring him down. So these are the kinds of things that we have to prevent the grains of sand coming here and spying on us. We have to prevent our consumer dollars from funding their military budgets. And we have to be so vigilant right now. We've got to get our allies on board with that as well.
Just a little common sense could go a very long way. We just ignore blatant things that are sitting in front of our faces.
Yeah.
But how do we get the factories, the manufacturers to come back here? Because we make it uncomfortable for them to China, they just go to Malaysia or Thailand or Vietnam. How do we get them to come back here?
One of my favorite Don Quixote activities during the first Trump administration turned out to be my attempt to get the Reciprocal Trade Act passed, right? And the president mentioned it in his State of the Union speech in 2019. I had Congressman Sean Duffy helping me. And what the Reciprocal Trade Act would do is, think about this. We have the lowest tariffs of any country in the world, okay? Which means by definition, we're at a disadvantage, not just to communist China, but also to all the countries in Europe, Germany, France, whatever. All India's got the highest tariffs relative to us. All the countries you just mentioned, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, okay? So what's my point? My point is that we have highly productive workers. We can beat them on a level playing field. So the president came up with this concept that the Reciprocal Trade Act is if a country won't lower their tariffs to our level, then the president would have the authority to raise our tariffs to their level. I mean, it's elegant. I mean, talk about common sense. That's the most common sense thing in the world. Let me say it one more time. If a country like India has much higher tariffs than we do, right? They're stealing our factories and jobs, right? It's not a level playing field. So we give them a choice. Congress gives the president the legal authority to give India the choice. Okay, you either lower your tariffs to our level, we'll compete fairly with you there, or if you keep those higher tariffs, we'll raise ours to yours. So that would be the single most effective way overnight to level the playing field and begin to see our factories bloom. What we don't want to do is have to spend endless gobs of subsidies from the taxpayers to defend ourselves. That's the wrong way to do it. It's got to be at the cheater's expense, not at our expense.
Right. You know, we have the greatest institutions of higher learning in the world. And yet it seems like things are happening to them that are hard to explain. The Confucius Institute, are they intentionally indoctrinating our students?
There's no question about that. That's part of the 1,000 grains of sand influence operations. We are inundated with Chinese attempts, communist Chinese attempts, to change our attitudes about them in a way which will then allow them to have their way with us. And the Confucius Institutes, if you look, you look at one end where they get a guy like Tim Walz, early in his political career, they romance him, they throw him a bunch of money. He's bringing kids over, right? Communist China, being indoctrinated. Oh, it's the greatest place. This is funny, darkly funny in a way. Okay, think about this. Tim Walz, when he decided what day he was going to get married, when he chose his wedding date, what did he choose? He chose the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre of communist China. I mean, what? That's how deeply indoctrinated. So then on the other end, you've got things like the Confucius Institute here, which is K through 12. What do? They shower them with money. Often these schools don't have enough money to buy textbooks and things like that. In come the communist Chinese with that money. But by the way, textbooks, contain revisionist history, Chinese communist propaganda, not history. So certainly there shouldn't be a single Confucius Institute allowed to operate on U.S. soil. And there's been a lot of activity to try to get that done, but more of that needs to happen.
Well, it has always amazed me how these things are right in front of our faces and we don't do anything about it. And I guess that was maybe the thing that the establishment didn't like about Donald Trump. He came in and did things that actually made sense and that really benefited the American people. He went to the United Nations and he says, you guys have to pay up as the agreement was for the protection. I mean, he's very straightforward. I mean, nothing confusing about what he has to say, and it makes sense. So I understand why they hate him so much. They'll do anything to keep him out of office. But can we trust the Chinese in terms of the things that they supply us? I've heard some people say they may be putting things into the products or doing things that undermine us. Would they do a thing like that?
They are doing that. That's already well documented. The funny thing about, the books I wrote, I started in 2006, 2006, the Coming China Wars, talking about how Chinese semiconductors could wind up in F-16s, and those F-16s could then be sabotaged, right? Everybody's going, oh, well, that's sci-fi. But then you fast forward to my days in the White House and during the security briefings, or you read a publicly released government report from the Pentagon now, and it's like all sorts of ways that the Chinese try to infiltrate our supply chains with their equipment, which is effectively spy equipment. I remember one of the fun things I did was with the Department of Energy, where we were buying these big generators and transmission equipment for our grid, right? And we're buying them from the Chinese. And it's like, wait a minute. It's like, we go in and look at that stuff, and there's actually things in there that could allow the Chinese to grab control of that. It's like crazy. So we were able, Dan Brulé did a beautiful job on this. We were able, in a very short amount of time, to ban the purchase of communist Chinese equipment for our electric grid. Those are the kinds of things we did. But they're doing that. I mean, Doc, they're bidding on all of our metro systems now nationally. Okay, we don't want Chinese equipment running our metro systems, because when in the scenarios they go and attack Taiwan, we have a decision to make. Do we help Taiwan or do we sit on the sidelines? If we help Taiwan, they start taking our subway system down and our grid down. So yeah, heck yes, they're doing all of that stuff, and we're not as vigilant as we should be. I mean, the social media stuff, I mean, the big concern there is that they're collecting our data and they can track us. So these are big considerations. Again, I'd like to mention the book again, because there's a beautiful chapter it's the New Mega Deal. It's newmegadeal.com on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. There's a great chapter in there by Rick Grinnell, who did a beautiful job in the first term and will almost certainly be in any second Trump administration, something to do with diplomacy and intelligence. And what he wrote about is what this whole attack on MAGA is like. America first is not America alone. Okay, and Grinnell fleshes that out. And one of the most beautiful things he says is that the mistake we make, not Donald Trump, but the mistake we made historically with foreign policy, is that we make promises that our resources don't allow us to fulfill. And so we wind up in endless wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we really need to be clear-eyed about what we can and cannot do. And to be honest, we are stretched very thin right now around the world. And Communist China historically has used those kinds of opportunities to do bad things. There was write about this in the Death by China book, Crouching Tiger. It's like when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, and what China did was invade India, right? And neither the Soviets could help India, which was their kind of client state at the time, and the Americans couldn't come to their rescue. So China went in there and grabbed territory that they still hold today, a place called Aksai Chin. So what's my point? My point is that China is far and away the number one existential threat. It's got 5 times as many people as we do. It's got a very, very strong manufacturing base. Russia has a bunch of nuclear weapons, but it's got a economy probably no bigger than Florida. And Iran, we had them under control. We can have them under control again by squeezing off their money. So it's China, 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 as the boss might say. And we've got to take that one seriously, sir.
Absolutely. Well, another area that China probably has some leverage over us is they hold a lot of our debt. What's the danger of that?
Well, they've held that for a long time, and the danger of that is, again, in a scenario. The most likely scenario would be a Taiwan scenario where they attack Taiwan and they blackmail us to stay out of it. But the same thing could happen with the Philippines because they're bullying the Philippines right now. So what are they have this concept sort of called unrestricted warfare. And what it means is that the warfare of the 21st century is not like you're seeing in Ukraine with the Russians necessarily. It's doing things like attacking our infrastructure, attacking our grid. And these are the kinds of things that we have to be careful about and prepare ourselves for. So this unrestricted warfare, they're going to come at us in all these different ways: financial, infrastructure, cyber attacks, this, that, and the other thing. And with the debt issue, if they were suddenly to dump all the bonds onto the market, right? You have a big supply. What does that do? It drives the price of bonds down because of the increased supply, and that spikes interest rates up and mortgage rates up because bond and prices and interest rates are inverse. So the threat there is they can spike our interest rates to 10, 12, 14% overnight and completely disrupt our credit markets and our housing markets. So that's yet another weapon they have cultivated. And by the way, a lot of the reason why they bought so many of our bonds is to manipulate their currency, which is yet another weapon. I mean, look, democracy is the greatest thing in the world, but the problem is I was here for 4 years with Donald Trump. We in Lighthizer, and we were hawks on China. Bannon was there early, and the same people sitting around that table from China are still sitting at that table with the Biden regime, and we're gone, and they'll be there for the next 30 years. They're just, so they are able to maintain a strategy long term with the same people, and they just play us like violins, and we go back and forth, and you get Biden, who's totally compromised. His son's compromised, and then Tim Walz, again, a Manchurian candidate. This guy is so dangerous, Dr. Carson. He is so dangerous because he hates the Trump tariffs and he thinks China's our friend. So how does that work, Tim?
Peter, you've been through quite a legal saga over the past few years. Can you walk the audience through this harrowing?
Sure. The central principle that I am fighting for is something called executive privilege, which is a doctrine that goes back to our very first president, George Washington. And he negotiated something called the Jay Treaty, which caused Congress to attack the White House and make demands on the White House. And so George Washington went to Capitol Hill, and on the floor of the Senate, he said simply that I, as the president and director of the executive branch, cannot command you, congressman, to come to the White House. Nor can you, Congress, command me or my officials to go to Capitol Hill. And why did he say that? Because we have what's called the constitutional separation of powers, which is a very important part of the construction of our democracy. And so over what's now almost 2 centuries, right, we've seen executive privilege invoked. We've seen the Supreme Court opine numerous times on the fact that a president, in order to have effective and efficient communication that best serves the American people, must have candor and confidentiality in his communications between and among his advisors. Okay, so this whole notion of executive privilege and the constitutional separation of powers is enshrined in our history. It's very important. Fast forward to the January 6th committee. It's an illegally formed, improperly constituted witch hunt committee that had only one purpose, and it was not to get to the bottom of the violence on Capitol Hill. It was to build a criminal case against Donald Trump to stop him from running for president. And so what happened to me is, just like many other White House people that I had served with, I received a subpoena to go to testify before the J6 committee. Contacted the president, President Trump, said, do you want the privilege invoked? He said, yes. Once the privilege was invoked by law, it was now my privilege to waive. And that's what I told the committee. But importantly, Doc, I also told the committee that, look, I'm happy to talk to you. All you have to do is go to the president, seek a waiver of the privilege. Now, they did not do that. They just held me in contempt. I was indicted, prosecuted, convicted, and wound up in prison. But what's interesting about all of that is a couple of things. Now, first of all, I'm the only person ever charged with that crime. That was a senior White House official, right, at the time of events.
Right.
There's been others who've been held in contempt. Eric Holder stands out. Merrick Garland right now is in contempt charge holding. He will not be prosecuted. So why? Because the Department of Justice itself, Dr. Carson, over a 50-year period has said that it's illegal for Congress to do that because it violates the Constitution separation of powers. So you ask yourself, if that's true, why was I prosecuted? And then you have to go to my speech at the Republican National Convention, where I point out that every branch of government involved in my incarceration involved Democrats. It was a Democrat majority in the House of Representatives holding me in contempt on a straight party line. Strict Democrats. It was a Democrat attorney general and his henchmen prosecuting me. And then it was a Democrat judge Democrat appointed Judge Obama, a guy named Ahmed Maiden, stripped me of every single defense.
Right.
Just like Judge Marchand in New York stripped Donald Trump of every single offense. And then I had to go to a woke DC all Democrat jury. So what I'm doing, serve my time, and they never should me in or to put me in prison until I had a chance to appeal my case. But they did that. So what does this tell you, America? It tells you that the Democrats have weaponized our now injustice system to promote their political ends, and that's yet another reason to throw these rascals out, because you don't want to live in a world where they can put you in prison for doing your duty.
Exactly.
Or going to a school board and complaining about diversity issues being taught when you want them to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. These woke issues. So that's my story. I served 4 months in a Miami prison, barbed wire, bad food, no medicine, tough stuff. But I did it because I'd rather stand up for the Constitution than get down on my knees before Biden and Harris and those woke fools. And I believe I will be borne out. History will bear out the fact that I was right. I have a landmark case that's going through first the appeals court in the District of DC, but ultimately it will go to the Supreme Court. I have no faith in the District of Columbia appeals court. It's a disgrace, to be honest. It's dominated not just by Democrats, but by these woke radical Democrats. And it's unlikely I'll get a fair look there, but hopefully it'll get to the Supreme Court. And here's the big question, Doc. It's like, does Congress have the constitutional authority to subpoena senior White House advisors?
Right.
The answer to that has to be no. If the Supreme Court doesn't say no to that, then we don't have the constitutional separation of powers or executive privilege. Presidential decision-making suffers and our Constitution is imploded. The second question in my case, which is interesting, is what constitutes a proper or formal invocation? And the judge in my case, the Democrat judge, really cut the knees from out under me, pulling a little, what I would argue would be a shady ruling to indirectly strip me of privilege. So it's a landmark case. It's a landmark historian. It will be the landmark historical case on executive privilege and the constitutional separation of powers. And if I win, that will be good for this country, and I'll be vindicated. If I lose, then I will mourn for this justice system, because there's no way they can come to any other conclusion than the one I suggested.
Yeah, I mean, if you lose that case, all Americans need to fear for their safety.
Yes.
They no longer be able to trust the justice system at all.
Yes.
I think maybe that's what Benjamin Franklin was talking about when he was asked, what do we have here, a monarchy or a republic? And he said a republic if you can keep it.
If you can keep it.
And this is that juncture right now. And American people should be watching this very carefully. And more importantly, learning how to vote appropriately, not just voting for the person who has a name that looks familiar to you, but finding out how they have behaved in the past in situations like yours. How did their representatives vote? Because we're talking about freedom in America and the press. I don't know what you think about the press, but they're the only business protected by our Constitution, because they were supposed to disseminate unbiased information to the people so that the country could be run on the will of the people. But they put not only their thumb on the scale, they put their foot on the scale. And they don't realize that the first thing that Marxist regimes do is completely control the media. They're digging their own grave and they don't even know it.
That's one of the 37 chapters in the new MAGA deal book, newmagadeal.com, little plug there for it, because we have essentially a legacy media that is totally compromised. It's pure propaganda. It's been anti-Trump. It's ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, CNN, MSNBC, outlets like Bloomberg. You've got Axios. These media companies, they hate Donald Trump so much that they're willing basically to give up all of their journalistic ethics. I mean, it's what they spin. So I would urge you to go to alternatives. Newsmax, you got Real America's Voice, you've got things like Breitbart News, Gateway Pundit. There's a conservative media, but it's not a fair fight right now.
No.
It's not a fair fight. We're getting overwhelmed. I mean, this debate that's coming up. I mean, think about this. ABC debate, September 10th, right? ABC used to be highly respected, but it's just, they ally with the pollsters, they give you woke polls, this and anything. But one of the moderators is a woman named Lindsay Davis. So if you dig a little deeper into her vita, what does she specialize in? She writes children's books on DEI. That's like her shtick, right? Now, if Sean Hannity was going to be a moderator at the ABC debate, you can imagine how the Harris camp would go ballistic on that. Yet Donald Trump is supposed to grin and bear it when Lindsay Davis, who is kind of the polar opposite of Sean, bless Sean, is going to sit there and ask Donald Trump questions about the woke social agenda when the American people want to hear about the economy, inflation, the border, Gaza, crime in our streets, strategic energy dominance. It's like, it's just not a fair fight. It's not a fair fight. But the American people, many of them are able to see through it. The problem is that the ones that may decide this election, they might be swayed by the woke legacy media.
Well, this is the time when we hope and pray that the American people are smart enough to see through this. I mean, if they're not, unfortunately, they're going to get what they deserve. But I'm hoping that.
Doc, if I may, it's like this is kind of right up your alley here. It's in a way, it's like I think one of the big problems with the American media is how they're financed, right? If you look, any given day, you go to these news stations, and predominantly the commercials are what? Big pharma. Big pharma, right? And what does big pharma like to do? They like to offshore our jobs, communist China and the rest of the world. They like to import slave labor into this country because it's lower wages. The big pharma are basically international companies. They're not American companies, even though you think they are, but Pfizer, J&J, which were supposed to be an American icon, they're spread out all over the world. And so I think part of the problem here is if you look at who's advertising on these cable channels, they exert a lot of power. I mean, Tucker Carlson got taken out on Fox because he spoke the truth. I think the new MAGA Deal book, newmagadeal.com, can actually be an important weapon. I started writing it right after the 2022 election, because that election, frankly, was a tremendous disappointment. That red tide that was supposed to give us big majority in the Senate big majority in the House of Representatives, never came. And I think part of the problem is that people don't understand how sensible Make America Great Again and the movement is. All we want is a strong manufacturing base and endless wars, a secure border. But people don't understand also what the policies are that we espouse. And what I tried to do in the new MAGA deal in 37 chapters, 100 actions in 100 days, show that this is how we can make things right.
You know, if people are just wise enough to do comparisons, that's why we have a brain. You can see what one person did, what another person has done. You don't have to be a political guru in order to figure out which thing works best for you and for your family. And vote that way, because if we don't, if we become a socialist country, if we allow Marxist government to get into place, you don't come back from that. There's very few instances where people have ever been able to recover from that situation. So I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being such a patriot and being willing to take the slings and arrows on behalf of the rest of us. And I do believe it's going to pay off in the long run. So thank you, Peter. All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Peter Navarro for coming on the show today. His experience and knowledge of China are unsurpassed. Just a wealth of knowledge. His willingness to fight for the people, sacrifice himself. It's really something that we all should take note of. And thank you for joining this week's program. Please subscribe, Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Rate us, review us. We love those 5-star ratings. And more importantly, tell your friends, tell your family, tell people who need to know the truth, who want to spread common sense. And I also want to remind you that American Cornerstone has started a new podcast called Heard on West Exec, the podcast that discusses everything you need to know about the executive branch of government. And you might be interested, just out of curiosity, you may be interested in joining the federal government yourself. If so, I encourage you to take advantage of this podcast series. And until next week, remember the cornerstones: faith, liberty, community, and life. See you next week.